Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Real Estate Development Insights podcast, where we bring you ideas, experiences, and best practices from the real estate development industry. My name is Payam Nursalahi. My guest for this episode is Richard Witt. Richard is the principal and global head of housing at BDP, which is a design firm based in Toronto. And Richard has a very long and very productive bio, but basically he's been very active all over the globe. He has worked in Prague, Geneva, London, Shanghai, and I think India. And he has also been involved in some of the most iconic projects and planning projects in the city of Toronto. One of the more notable projects that he's been involved in is AD Atlantic, which won the 2022 Governor General's Medal in Architecture. And it was Toronto's first mass timber framed office building in over a century. In addition to that, Richard has been part of the evolution process of the midrise in Toronto and part of the original team who worked on the midrise guidelines. And in this episode, we're going to talk to him about both of those things and also where we stand as nation, as a city, as a community compared to other cities and other major cities across the world. What his thoughts are about potential suggestions, potential improvements that we can make and make this as a better community. As always, you can find all the relevant information and links on our website, realestatedevelopmentinsights.com, realestatedevelopmentinsights.com, and please remember to subscribe to the show. And even better, tell others about it and help us grow the show together. Thank you and enjoy listening. Hi, Richard. Welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me on.
My pleasure. Why don't we start by a little bit of an introduction? Who is Richard? Give us a little background. You have a long bio that I can read for about a half an hour, but I'd rather get on your own.
Okay, maybe I'll do something a bit more concise. I'm Richard Witt. I'm an architect living and working based in Toronto. I work for a company called BDP Quadrangle, which is a tie-up of Quadrangle Architects Limited in Toronto since 1986, and BDP, a global firm working for 60 plus years. Most of my work is in the housing sector, a variety of scales from mid-rise scales up to big towers, 60-story plus towers, quite a lot of master planning work at different scales, and really thinking about housing as a typology, as a product, how we can deliver homes for people, how we can deliver value for clients who are in that business.
Perfect. Thank you for the short version of it. We'll put the long version of your bio in the text so people can check it as well.
Thanks. If you
what does your current
bedtime reading?
Yes, bedtime reading. That's an actually interesting read. What does your title mean? Your job title right now is Head of Global Housing. So can I take that as if you're working globally?
Global Head of Housing, yes. So I'm responsible for the housing sector across all BDP studios, which is 20 studios now. We have quite a lot in the UK and mainland Europe, the Middle East, India, Singapore, China. Most of our housing work is in North America, probably about 75%, but I'm charged with growing that sector globally across the studios. So Toronto's been an amazing place to work in the housing sector for the past 20 years, and we've learned how to deliver housing at scale and how to create product which is a marketable offering. I think we have a lot to offer to a lot of places.
Thank you. Can you do me a favor? You have worked, obviously you're working as a global head, lived and worked, I believe, in Prague, Geneva, London, and I want to say Shanghai if I'm not wrong. You've been...
I didn't live in Shanghai, but I worked there as well, and also in...
Okay, and also in India. So quite a wide vision globally. Mm-hmm. Can you paint us a picture in terms of where we are as a community, as a society in Toronto, in GTA, in terms of not necessarily the quality of the build, but also the quality of the environment, what we were building, the typologies that we were building. Just paint us a picture. Where are we
in comparison to other places?
Correct. Let's say what you've seen around the world, like obviously Prague is like one of my favorite places to look at the architecture when you look at those mid-rise buildings or those art setups. But if you were to take your best pick from all these places that you've worked with, and again, I don't mean in terms of quality, but more so in terms of I don't mean in terms of quantity, more on the quality of living, quality of having a future city inside. Paint us a picture. Where are we? What's good? What's bad? What's ugly?
what I've observed is that housing is always delivered as a commoditized product. And sometimes that housing was delivered in a time when it was built differently and when people had different attitudes, but it exists. Cities are built accretively. So you may have built housing 200 years ago. The housing may have been tweaked, but is essentially the same product. A lot of single-family housing, which is the historic Toronto in the 1900s, that was delivered from 1900 to 1940. Places like Prague or the surrounding areas, a lot of the housing there was delivered in the Soviet era. So even though you've been to Prague, I take it, and you've been on holiday and you've gone through the old city center, and there is housing in there, but the bulk of the housing is in kind of communist housing blocks, which are around the city center. That in Bratislava, even more. China has been delivering housing at scale and very efficiently for a long time, and they've got a lot of people to house. I remember going past, you drive out the city centers there, and there's housing that just goes on and on for miles. And there's some things about that which I saw, which I don't think culturally, it's always a bit different. The way that people live is a bit different. The way that people eat, do those things is a bit different. But some of it was quite nice. We have different attitudes, I think, towards how much we'll accept light, how much we'll accept space between people, personal distance. Different countries think about that quite differently. But I think in essence, the art of delivering housing is understanding the human condition, understanding human proportion and scale, understanding social interaction. And those things are nuanced from culture to culture, but there's also quite a lot of similarity.
So would you think, because I know you work a lot in master planning and having worked on previous guidelines and how we're essentially thinking about our communities and cities, do you think we're set to have a future-proof community and city as Toronto and GTA, as if it's going to be a still attractive place to live for people?
We've gone through a bit of a wild and exciting time for the past 20, particularly the past 10 years, where I talked about housing as a commoditized thing. I think because there are aspects of it which aren't, but it's usually private sector based. So it's based on somebody investing in the creation of it for the purposes of living. We got it into a point where the investment and the speculation of housing overtook the provision of housing for people. And I've said this before, but I think it has been a difficult year or two. And I think that we're not through difficult times if your primary activity is housing, but I think it's better for the city. I think a lot of projects that I've worked on that I really like are of a different kind of scale that aren't just satisfying somebody buying something from a piece of paper based on an amount of dollars and an amount of square feet. That's really been, I think, the past is escalated, and there's like an idea of investors and people who are investing, but a lot of them were local, and then it became speculators, which was a different proposition. The investor market's good. The end user market is great. I think we're returning to those things as a city. Toronto's got a great future. I believe in Toronto as emerging as a global city. It's going to have a lot of people coming to it. It's got a great political positioning, I think, with adjacent neighbors and relationships. I think we've got a lot of great resources. So I believe long-term in the future of the city, and I think that this is actually going to help us to get to where we need to be, which is not just one kind of housing for one kind of purchaser. We need workforce housing, we need student housing, we need seniors housing, we need housing for end users, we need housing for families, we need housing for first-time people. And I think that once we get through a little bit of turbulence, that we will revert to having a real city and building really great housing.
Thank you. So let's zoom in Toronto. In Toronto, like you mentioned, for the past almost decade, the focus was on return on investment, maximizing intensities, getting more densities and height and smaller units. And we're in a troubled state right now with that type of product. But these days, what we're seeing moving on the market, especially these days where there's not that much movement, that they're the missing middle types, the multiplex size, the smaller project, the citizen developers. And we've talked extensively on this podcast with previous guests about the importance of that typology and enabling a new class of citizen developers to start those types of projects. I want to focus with you more on the midrise side, because I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that you were one of the parties involved in the original design guidelines that Toronto came up with about 16 years ago, I think, 15, 16 years ago, on mid-rises. Maybe walk us, I want to try to do a little bit of time travel with you. What were we thinking as a city back then in terms of midrise? What was the idea behind those guidelines? What went through that guideline? What were lessons learned? And then I guess we moved through the time together.
Yeah, those guidelines, I think 2007, 2008 is around when they were done. We were part of a team. There was other people on the team led by Brooke McElroy, but we provided a lot of built form guidelines and diagrams, many of which still used until recently. The city, as it's growing, Toronto has a very unusual structure, which is all what people call the yellow belt, which is all the single family neighborhoods. It's quite odd and not always ideal that some of those neighborhoods are very close to the city center and are, under the official plan of the city, protected. So you can't intensify to any great extent those sites. What you've just referred to about missing middle, there's been some movement in that, which I think is encouraging, is most people will not want to see very significant density deployed in those areas, but modest increases in density for laneway houses has been a great initiative, sixplexes, all those kind of things. I think that's really great. What has happened historically has been that all density was directed to growth centers or to avenues. So the city center, to North York, to Yonge and Eglinton, certain places where you're seeing real spikes in height. And then the idea was that other density, which is a more gentle density, be directed towards the city's avenues, so Dundas Street, College Street, places like that, which are real arteries into the city. And that's also, when you look at those ideals, it's a really great place to intensify because they've got some kind of surface transit, not higher order transit, but streetcars or buses, so they're connected. They're also on the edge of neighborhoods, so you can increase gently and then create a frame to the neighborhoods. And all of those things are best intentions. Then when you zoom into that, what kind of built form should those things take? So midrise, which is historically in scale to the width of the right of way to the height. So you end up with, on somewhere College Street, or parts of College Street, you end up with a 6-story-ish kind of building. So they generally ended up being 6 or 8. The challenges that came with it was that all of the zoning for the sites is done from the 1920s or 1930s. So they're all saying this building should be 14 meters or 12 meters or something like that. And they're also in very small slices. So in order to develop a building of real scale, you need to assemble 4 or 5 sites. And people say, I'm going to sell it for this, I'm going to sell it for this. Before you know it, your land cost base is quite high. And then made with the best of intentions, definitely the built form became quite complicated. So, we want a street wall and that's going to be 80% of the right of way and it's going to set back. And that's great. Framing the street, creating pedestrian scale, that's great. Then the terracing at the back, which I suppose when you look at it, the idea of the midrise guidelines is a built form guideline. So that works. What I always felt was really missing from it was a density cap. So if you said buildings on the avenues are 3 times density, 3.5 times density, then you have an amount of density and a built form envelope in which to build. But instead, what happened was there is no density cap, so it all became speculation. And so people are betting on how much density can I get on this site, which relates to the value. So the landowners are then speculating on how much they can sell it. So everything goes up and up and up because there's no guideline. And Toronto is you asked me what things are like in the world. Toronto is a very strange place in that the zoning is all massively out of date and you can't do it. If you work in New York, you go to New York, there is zoning in place. You can cap and trade. You can buy 3 sites and take some of the density from there to there. But essentially, a lot of you're not speculating on the margins of land price, which is what's caused this problem. The second big problem was that when you went to buy one of these sites, you went to do it and you had all this speculation. You also were not able to do this within an easy framework, a zoning framework. So you couldn't go and say, the zoning says, the city's put out guidelines that say 6 stories. For example, the zoning says 6 stories, so that's what I'm going to build. Instead, it was required that you get a zoning bylaw amendment for the site. Sorry, 1 second. Okay, I'll go back to that. The second problem with that was that a zoning bylaw amendment was required for each site. So you can go to a site and say, the city's policies have said 6 stories. The approvals process says if I do what is being requested of me, then I can get that. Instead, a zoning bylaw amendment means now you're suddenly in for a process which is a year, 2 years, an unknown amount of years. And so if you're going to invest into that process, which is very lengthy and very costly, then suddenly the Why would I do that for exactly what's being asked of me? For that, if I'm going to demonstrate that actually I want 8 stories, 9 stories, 10 stories. And so then you move into a process where it's speculation on top of speculation on top of speculation. And I made this point many times to the planning authorities over the years, saying, why don't you just say, we've put out these guidelines that say 6 stories. If you do this, 6 stories or whatever, right of way, let's say. So 6 stories, 8 stories, depending on the road. If you do it within that, if you do it within this density, committee of adjustment is your avenue. And a lot of people would have taken that. And I think you referred to citizen developers, which is, in my experience, has been most of the people that have tackled mid-rise building over the years. I think that would encourage people to do more of that work. And we could have, you never know. But I think looking back, I feel like we would have unlocked a lot more avenue development, because now that we've got to a point where authorities have put in place 6 stories, yes, and you can do this, but the land prices have already risen quite a lot, so it still remains quite difficult to do. So I hope that more of this development will happen, because I think this is a really good thing for the city to intensify these avenues.
Thank you for the background. So I couldn't agree with what you said even more, because there was a report a few years back that they had looked at all the mid-rise projects that had resulted as a result of that guideline, and they fell under that application. At that point, over the course of 10 years, it was around 130 projects, which was basically 10 buildings per year, which just talked or spoke volumes about the complexity of the process that you just explained. I had the opportunity and privilege of being part of those projects, multiple of them. And exactly like you said, the minute you got into the ZBA application, the site plan application, the asks were unlimited and they were infinite. And then we kept going back and forth for years on turning radiuses and setbacks and garbage pickup, and then you name it.
Yeah, the favorite one of mine, and if our client who was on it at the time hears this, he'll laugh, but we were working on a project on Sinclair Avenue, which was already zoned. So Sinclair actually stands out for me as a striking example of, you've put in a rapid, just not really an LRT, but a dedicated streetcar right-of-way that you've upzoned all the sites to say, on this site, this width, 12 stories. It's already zoned, you can skip that thing. So we went into the first meeting and said, we see you've got this zoning, and this is great. What we've noticed, though, is that at the rear, you've done the zoning, but it's still very close to the neighbors, so we could be 12 stories right up against. So we proposed that we would take some of that density and just move it, so it would be set back from the street, but a little bit higher. And that opened the floodgates to all kinds of requests, one of which was a conical angular plane coming from the corner, which anybody who's ever designed a building trying to implement a conical angular plane, it's not only a huge loss of density, but also a lot of embodied carbon, a lot of structural transfer, like an absurdity. And so it's just that sort of attitude has caused a lot of problems. Now, my experience is that the planning department has changed their mind about a lot of things quite a lot. There's been updated mid-rise guidelines, which have massively simplified the built form, and those things are great.
Yeah, I agree. The asks at some point they were basically killing the project. Let's put it this way. And like you mentioned, a lot of people made money or lost money, significant amount of money, based on all those layers of speculations that you were just talking about. Because for a while, there was a business of just let's go get density and then we get more after what we got in the first round approved, or we just don't get it and we can't provide the returns that we've promised our investors, which unfortunately we're seeing a lot of those these days. Okay, so that we got the background set. These days we have EHON going on. And like you mentioned, between Jason Thorne's team, which has been pretty active in terms of updating a few things, and even prior to that, Greg Linton, when he was in the Chief Planning Officer in City of Toronto, they were working on a whole bunch of things. If you were to give them advice in terms of, let's say, the top 3 things they need to get really right in terms of the items that they're working on right now, because it's part of the EHON and major streets and all the initiatives they have, I believe there are thousands of parcels in the City of Toronto that their zoning is being updated and changed. What are the top 2-3 things that you think they should really get right this time that will facilitate the process?
Well, definitely the first one, and we've already been talking about it, provide certainty is the first one. If too much uncertainty creates a compounding level of problems in buildings of this scale. If you're doing an 8-story building, if you go 2 months over your construction schedule on an 8-story building, That is a big problem. If you go 2 months over on a 50-story building, it's still a problem, but not as much of a problem. So creating certainty that enables speed through things is definitely the number one. I mentioned the speed of things, that there's a lot of further information also useful at site selection. I don't know if that's the city can provide it, or maybe it's not an easy way to do it, but I think we talked about this before, but I feel like every single mid-rise building I ever did on a streetcar track, the sewer is also always on the other side.
True.
It's like a $300,000 if it's a 40-story tower.
It's a lottery ticket. You never know what you get. That's very true.
So I think better information about things like that, which can create these sudden costs, I think is also very important. The speed of things is always a problem, and the kind of subsurface conditions has also always been a problem. So this is not really for the city, but for any person considering doing it, get as much subsoil information as you can in advance of tendering things. And I remember one project we did, and we'd done many boreholes on the site, and there were an aquifer curving in between the things. Maybe it's just about providing context of where waterways used to be, because the whole city is built on a series of now underground rivers. So there's a lot of water problems and soil conditions that are here. But approval, so certainty is good. Approval speed is definitely second. If we were doing a house, you can get that permit in a short amount of time. Site plan approval is probably a good thing for the city, but maybe there's a site plan light or something which doesn't involve satisfying every condition. I can't tell you the number of buildings which have had to be shaped around trees. And I love trees as much as any book, maybe not as much as anybody. I love trees. Toronto has a great tree canopy. It's a really important asset to the city, but not every tree needs to be saved. And the good news about trees is that you can plant another one and that they'll grow thick. So trees, site plan approval, heritage. I'm not sure what's happened in Toronto and heritage, and I see you laughing there knowingly, but my observation appears to be that 50 years ago, we knocked down anything that was good, or quite a lot of things that were really good, and I wish that we hadn't. But now that we've knocked them down, saving every old piece of townhouse facade that's meaningless is not a useful thing. Let's think more about heritage and built form and cities as a layer of accretive elements rather than preservation, which is not useful, because cities are only good if they're relevant. And an old piece of nonsensical townhouse facade doesn't add any value or any quality to anybody.
I would actually argue the other way as well. I would say we are losing lifeblood in certain parts of the city just because we're trying to preserve more than what we're trying to create. And it really bothers me sometimes when I drive downtown, there are certain areas that you can literally see they're dying because they fall under a whole bunch of different heritage preservation requirements, and you can't really touch anything. And if you can't touch it, no one's going to spend $2 million renovating something that's falling apart.
So I don't want to say I'm anti-heritage, because I'm not, and I do believe in keeping things that have value.
Prioritize better.
But a heritage conservation district doesn't mean preserving everything. And city, if you go somewhere like Paris, for example, everyone talks about Paris. These Haussmann boulevards, they were all built in one go, so they all look the same, and everyone likes that. There's a lot of consistency. But that's not Toronto. Toronto is not a consistent datum. You drive along these avenues which are filled with, they look so old, like people might tie their horses up outside. It's got that kind of vibe to it. It's like 2, it's 4, it's shanty. But another thing, and maybe this does relate a little bit to heritage, but other parts of the world, I've found really incentivized behaviors they want to see, which we don't. Instead, we seem to tax behaviors that we want to see. Like development charges is a good example, but even if we collected development charges and then put them as incentives for heritage. So we really want you to keep this piece of building. We think this is important. If you do that, we will give you enough to make it worth your while. Or inclusionary zoning is another good one. And that's all just downloading costs ultimately to end purchasers. So if you say social housing is really important, we want you to do it. Here's an incentive for you to do it. And then people will do those things because people aren't opposed to the philosophy of it. They're opposed to being in an untenable market position because of it, or having to pay for it punitively in comparison to others who aren't doing it. So I think that's a bit of a mind shift that we need to adopt, is incentivizing behaviors we want to see and enabling things that we want to see, which doesn't seem to have been the case for a few years now.
I want to say keep for anyone who's been listening to our podcast, I keep repeating what Jonathan Diamond said in one of our previous episodes, where he pointed out, but I believe that he was very correctly pointing it out, that if you try to optimize for 100 different things, you end up losing the main goal, which was actually providing quality housing, affordable housing in the place that people want to live. And I think the bottom line is that even with heritage, like many other things, when it comes to the context of housing, pick your battles, prioritize it, like you said, what you just said. Just give it an incentive. We worked on a heritage church conversion, which was actually, I would argue that it was a good thing because it was a very old church with a great facade. But it was very expensive for the developer. Like at the end of the day, and that particular job, the developer ended up paying the difference basically out of their pocket. But not everyone can do, and we're not in a market that a lot of people can afford doing something like that. I want to go back to some of the conversation about the midrise that we just had. So let's pretend I'm the citizen developer for a second. I want to go and take advantage of these recent changes in terms of major streets or EHONs, or try and start a new midrise project. Well, for argument's sake, let's say it's a 6-story building with 20, 30 units, whatever I can get in it.
Mm-hmm.
What are the top 2 or 3 decisions or pointers that you would give me as someone who's been around doing this for a while, for me to either make good decisions up front or some 2 or 3 pitfalls that I should be avoiding?
The first thing, and what I see most with a problem, and this does a little bit if you're talking, it depends a little bit on if you're talking about if it's a rental building or if it's a condo for sale building.
I think focus on the rentals for now, because
okay, so the rental one I think makes it easier in a way, and is an obstacle that when people are trying to sell that they can't overcome, which is to join everything up. Doing something which later costs you a lot of money can cost you a lot more than the amount of money that it seems. Line up all the structure is like number one. The kind of condo world for years has been, we're going to optimize every single square feet, and you end up with a floor plate and then a transfer and then a floor plate and then a transfer and then a floor plate. And so not only do you end up with a lot of difficult detailing conditions, maybe your unit is ultra optimized, but if that unit is so good, why isn't that the unit all the way up? And maybe you don't get that extra 100 square feet, but you're going to save, you could tell me better, but how long does it take to reset the forms, to create a transfer slab and to do all of that stuff? And I feel like there's a lot of conversation about hard costs, but it doesn't always flow through to hard costs plus time savings. So I think that's quite important. Also, the other costs of when you're developing on a time is money is an overarching thing to almost everything with a mid-rise scale, I think. But one of the other things is, do you have to close the street to do things, or can you just deliver things quickly? So think about, Toronto's a very strong concrete city, and concrete's a great material for many things. But if you're trying to do something in a tight urban condition and you've got the trucks standing outside churning and the guys on the site hammering for hours, it's probably not the right response. And maybe not doing it in cast in place concrete means that you lose a few square feet. I think you more than make that up in not having your neighbors complaining nonstop because it's so noisy, not making a huge mess that everyone hates, and also just creating efficiency. That's the real one. Like top to bottom, gravity always wins. So if you're fighting gravity, you're not going to go, it's not going to go well. One of the other things.
I love that response, and that this speaks to your actual experience on the site, because both of them would be things that I would talk to our clients about. That, guys, if you're trying to build, and here's my frame of reference, and please correct me if I'm wrong. The way I look at it, and these EHON initiative enabled projects, is that when you're doing a 6-story building on a 60, 55, 75 foot wide lot, it's a hard sell. It's a hard thing to make the performer work. So anything that you can avoid from day one by, yes, you want to build a building, you want to make sure it looks good, but you can also, it's important to appreciate how much you can afford on a footprint like that. When you're building 30, 40, 50,000 square feet, it's really hard to basically distribute the extra cost of having that nice separation in your facade, for example, over 30,000 square foot, because it costs a lot, or the setback, or the awkward shapes that you have in the building. And I couldn't agree with you more in terms of access. A lot of these sites And this is, I think we've talked about this on podcasts before as well, that a lot of the sites, one of the things that when we come to a site to look at the project, we're like, guys, there's like probably $750,000 just in access cost, which has gone unnoticed prior to basically getting to that point. Because yes, you can, like you said, you can potentially do concrete or pour this or do that, but you have to close the street. You have to relocate hydro lines. You have to do a whole bunch of things, which will cost you an arm and a leg. Right or wrong, that's how it is operating these days. So
I agree. My process of going through midrise sites is there's a death by 1,000 cuts. It's we've got to pay for this. We've got to pay for this. And the performer's much better than me, but there's always just so many problems. I think the great news is, I think 10 years ago, though, it was just you were doing it in cast in place concrete, and there wasn't really a lot of other options that were viable. Now I think you can do it with a kind of stubby system. You can do it with dimensional lumber. You can do it with mass timber. You can do it with a modular precast system.
Panelized.
So many options. So I think there's always also, and again, I'm sure that you know much better about this than me, but there's also a tendency to want to competitively tender everything. And by the point that you get to that, I think even if you end up paying slightly more than you think you would have paid, although you can never really know, tying yourself to a system and making informed decisions very on, saying, you know what, for this system, we've done a look. We think of these 5 systems, this one is going to be competitive. We want to lay out our building using that system. So not thinking so much of plans and laying out plans, but thinking of systems and purchasing a system which creates a product, I think is the only way to go to achieve these. I'm also going to say one other thing, which I think is quite difficult for people to come to. Building is always complicated. If you're new to it, the mid-rise is actually quite a complicated scale. If I do a tower, I've got all the complications of the mid-rise and then another 30 or 40 stories to amortize that cost over. So thinking of one in itself, I don't think is a winner. If you want to concentrate on mid-rise, you're going to commit, I'm going to do 5 of these. You're going to do the first one. You're going to work through it. It won't be your highest performing financially, but you'll figure out all the problems. Feed all of that learning back into the second one, the third one, the fourth one. After a couple, you'll have a system the same way that you did it before, but tweaked, and then the same way. And you can build on it. So think not just of a building, but a strategy and a housing strategy.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for saying that, because going forward, I'm going to have our future clients listen to this part of the conversation before we enter into bid review meetings and design development meetings, because you're absolutely right. Midrise has its own unique characteristics, which you need to lock in a lot of major decisions up front, and you can't just leave it open until the very last minute. Let's see 17 bits later who's shorter by $10,000 or who's lower by $10,000. And the second part of that comment, you just made me smile and laugh a little bit, because one of our clients who we've done multiple projects for, multiple mid-rises for, over the years, he's heard me too many times saying it's complicated, because we were dealing with details and it's complicated. A few years ago, when we finished one of the projects, he actually bought me a hat that says it's complicated at the front. I have it framed somewhere. It is a complicated project. And yes, that's very true. And to be honest with you, that's why we're doing this, because at the end of the day, I hate the one-offs, because they typically end up making a lot of mistake on the first one. Unfortunately,
and then
just
give up
because
and say, this didn't work, so now I'm not going to do it anymore, when actually you've just learned a lot and the second one maybe would work.
Yes, and that just take that and go to the second one, but go to the first one knowing that you're going to make mistakes and have allowances. And if everything is tied to the last penny, to very tight margins and contingencies, we're going to have problems. I want to zoom in even a little bit more. Yeah, we've talked about Toronto, and now I want to talk about one of your, I know you work with sustainable material. Your company works with what is these days referred to as modern methods of construction. You guys have won awards specifically on the AV Atlantic project, which was an office project, mass and timber project. I think you guys won the Governor General's Award for that project. Walk us through that landscape a little bit. What are you seeing? How are you thinking about it in terms of new material, or I guess new application of the old material and modern methods of construction? And we'll go from there.
Yeah, we could have a 3-hour conversation about modern methods of construction, or its parent piece of taxonomy designed for manufacturing and assembly. Well, I've referred to this already, but because we were in an up market and everything was going well, people didn't want to risk trying something new. It's been fairly obvious for quite a while, to me anyway, and to others, that the way we're doing things is not the best way of doing things, that there's other newer ways, and construction has often been identified as one, I think, the second least innovative industry. So that there is lots of great things that are coming, and this a decline in housing provision, I think it opens an opportunity, unlocks some mental space to think about how we should be doing things. And we've been giving it a lot of thought. And this partly comes back a little bit to a strategy of how you do things. When I was a young architect, quite a while ago, somebody I was working with, I was actually in London, I worked with a guy, and he said, don't forget, whatever you're doing, it's always going to come down to a man on a site with a hammer. And 30 years ago, there was definitely probably was a man then. Maybe it's not now, and hopefully it isn't always just a hammer anymore, but it used to be. But, one of the most interesting things about AT Atlantic, or interesting things, but like a sort of a thing which I wasn't necessarily expecting, was when we went to the site, was how quiet and clean it was. So if you're doing a cast in place concrete thing, smash, there's a crew of like a lot of people and doing all this stuff. When we saw them installing the nail laminated timber and the glue lam mass timber structure, there was 4 people there, and they were installing the structure, and it went up very quickly and it was quiet. But also it was being manufactured in Barrie. The deck was manufactured in Barrie, and the wood came from somewhere north of Montreal in Quebec. But so it also unlocks industry a little bit. So right now we're concentrated on everybody has to be here on this site doing things. But if you start to spread that out, I think there's a lot of economic benefit to the region. It takes the pressure off a little bit. If everybody needs to work in Toronto, then everybody needs to live in Toronto, which means everything compounds. Whereas if you can spread that industry out, if you can ship things in and just install them quietly, there's obvious opportunities. The other real opportunity is that when you're working outside under all weather conditions, and good on them, like this winter that we've just had, and you drive past a construction site and it's minus 4 million, and there's someone, there at 7 a.m, and I think this is no way to build things. So building in a climate controlled environment with factory oversight, you can get much better quality of things under those conditions and then assemble them. So I think the modern methods of construction is an inevitable way that we're going to travel, but there's also a wide variety. It goes all the way from the story that there's a hotel in New York in the Bowery called Citizen M, and the legend is that was made all in Poland, and it was shipped as complete units, even with the bedding on, with the sheets on the bed and put into place. So you can go all that way, and I quite rightly, people find that quite scary, that you've got it so far. But there's a huge variety from that to just components. Hospitals, they quite often do all the bathrooms are a unit that's shipped, that's placed in there. So you can imagine the time savings, you can imagine the speed, you can imagine the quality just from having these pieces. We can do that with cladding components. So instead of recently the material of choice has been window wall because everyone knows it has less risk. People understand it. That's become more difficult to use, I think, partly because of sustainability requirements, because of the performance issues of it, and sensibilities have changed. But there's lots of other components. It's not a midrise project, but we did a project recently in Vaughan, which had pre-glazed precast system, which took a quarter of the time to install. But it's not really, all of these things are available, or many things are available to us. I think what's limiting us is risk management and imagination. I think we can do a lot within existing industries, which can save a lot of time. I don't know how many that. Probably we can talk about modern methods of construction for a long time, but we're seeing a lot of structural systems and modular precast. We're doing an affordable housing project in Etobicoke, which is using precast structure, which is unusual, but makes sense. Why do you have to pour it when the freezing cold? Pour it all in advance and put it in place quickly.
I think that's one of the things that is very interesting, at least for me, on the mid-rise scale, is that it actually allows you to play with these different elements and try and figure out what works perfectly for your site and your project and your scale. Because to your point, when you go to the 14, 15, 20, 30, 40 stories, you're going to build in concrete. It's just, there's no real viable scale. I know someone might argue that Empire State was built with steel about 100 years ago or so, but these days, at least, let's put it this way, in Toronto, I think it's very hard to convince someone to build a 40-story building with anything other than concrete. But when you talk about, call it 5 to 8 stories or 10 stories building these days, there are probably a dozen different things that you can either commit to entirely or mix and match and try and get the hybrid solution for the project, which we've done over the years. And I've been lucky enough to work on probably half a dozen different variations of these hybrid systems. To your point, each of them has their own benefits, pros and cons, and sometimes you go up really quickly, and sometimes you end up trying and learning hopefully for the next project, and it takes a little bit longer. In terms of, I want to go back to 80 Atlantic because I did have a privilege of visiting that site probably just before it was opened or around the opening ceremony a few years back. And since then, I've also worked on mass timber projects. The project that we work on Halsaw 230 Royal York with a prefabricated cassette system. So I'm wondering, what were your one or two takeaways from a project in 80 Atlantic, something that has to do with mass timber in terms of do this or don't do that on the next job? Does anything come to your mind?
I'm a bit biased, but I think we did a good job with most of that project. And one of the things was, in terms of managing cost, is mass timber there's different options for mass timber. It's a system. It was the first in the first ever really office building. All the other ones that were built 100 years ago were really warehouses. I think it's just, understanding the system and working with the system, because it's not just two lines that you draw. It's a system that works in a different way. The Royal York project with the cassettes, I think that's also a really great system, which I think with evolution and understanding of how that system relates to residential buildings, I think will go on to be great. The challenge and any challenges I feel that we had at 80 Atlantic were not related to the wood. The challenges were related, firstly, it was when we were doing the underground, it was the rainiest season ever. And we had something like 40 weather days. That's a bit of
doing that whenever you're taking on something new.
The other real problem always with wood is moisture. You're in a battle with moisture and you can't control it. So I would advise anybody doing a mass timber building to tent it afterwards, because it just takes the pressure off. And there's a line item that says, this costs this much, but if you can't open for an extra month because you have to let the building air out and dry, how much does that cost? I don't know. But I think those are really important issues. I want to come back, though, to something you were saying. You were talking about modern methods of construction and cost of things. I had a sort of a joke, and as an immigrant, I never really grew up with hockey as a sport for myself, although I don't mind hockey. I can skate even a little bit. But
you and I both.
Like probably 50% of the city. But I always talked about midrise as what I refer to as the reverse hockey hair approach. The hockey hairs with the sort of bad haircut coming out the back, which is supposed to be good, and then short on top, and you cover it with the helmet. The reverse hockey hair approach is, instead of a business up front, party in the back, it's a party up front, business in the back. And that's because I've always hated working on projects where you're spending money on things that you're not seeing. I think mass timber is a really great option, and you can open that up and you can see it, and it adds a huge amount of warmth to a living space. But generally, structure is something that you cover up. And even in some of the earlier mass timber projects like Rock Commons in Vancouver, it was done as a cheaper system. How do we do it cheaper? How do we do it faster? And then it's covered in drywall. I think you develop a system which is going to be efficient, which is going to be available, which is going to satisfy exactly what you need. And then you can always change the front facade, which is the bit that people see. And I think that's throughout time. Even I was telling somebody about this yesterday. On 80 Atlantic was the second phase of a two-phase project. And the first phase, when we started off, it was dirty. It had been there for 100 years. No one had ever cleaned it. So you may have seen this when you went there, but the other project was very much an efficiency play. It's an old kind of, I don't know what, built as like a wine warehouse, a little warehouse kind of thing. And so it was complicated. So we stripped out all of that complication and put it in a new edition, which was at the threshold of what was necessary to not have to go through site plan approval. So it was sort of 10% additional density. But the architecture, the design, we put in these Corten steel fins, which is the rusting metal. And it was done because we thought it looked really nice next to red brick. When they cleaned the building, though, the red brick was only the front facade, and the side brick was some sort of buff one. So I'm assuming that that's the cheap stuff that you normally wouldn't see. And I think it still looks good, but we accidentally exposed it. So I think that's a strategy, is what do you do at the front? Really presenting yourself.
Right? This becomes a part of the character of the building. So
spend the money where you can see it, spend the money where it adds value, and then be ruthlessly efficient everywhere else.
100% agree. And one of the good things, the one at least in my experience with mass timber, was we had to go through alternative solution path on that one project, but I know code has been changed and a lot of changes have been made recently.
Mm-hmm.
And I think over there we had more than 75% of the wood in the ceiling left exposed, which gives you a very warm and nice feeling when you go inside the unit. And even on the walls, we had a whole bunch of walls that were not covered with drywall. So that was a nice experience. I want to try and wrap this up. Richard, this has been fun. We have a traditional question on the podcast. If we give you a magic wand for the next 5 minutes, and if you could make your wish, whatever that wish can be, whatever, like in terms of changing the law, regulation, mindset, whatever you want, to help us move toward where we are as an industry, as a society, as a community, and as it pertains to the housing crisis, housing affordability, what would be the one wish or one change you make to portray a better future for us?
Well, that's quite a tough one because I think there's quite a lot of wishes. Can I do all of them with the wand? Or it's just one that I have to settle on? The first thing, as it comes top down, I think the private sector building industry in Toronto, in the Greater Toronto area, has been really good for a long time and has really shouldered the burden of providing housing. And housing is very important, and quality housing is very important, but not all housing is equal. So think that the burden of affordable housing, which is very important, of social housing, which is very important, I don't think that should be downloaded to the private sector, except in cases like Regent Park, I think is a great example of, we've got some land, you can have some land for this, you build us that. That's a way of utilizing, I think, a very effective sector and system of building to unlock things that we need. So not downloading societal problems onto the housing industry, I think, is a bit of an overarching thing. Incentivizing I said this before, but incentivizing the growth that we want to see rather than punishing people for providing housing. Mid-rise housing, I love. Many of my favorite projects I've done have been of that scale, and I feel very proud of the contributions they've made to the street and to the public realm and the kind of housing options that we've provided in them. I would love to see more of that. The things that I've mentioned, I'd like to think that my magic wand would be, how can you unlock this for us rather than making it more difficult than doing a 50-story tower? Because we need all of these things. We need high-rise density, we need mid-rise density, we need social housing, we need connected housing. Toronto is in a trajectory despite this little bump. Toronto is heading towards being a global city, and unfortunately, I think the inevitable result of that is that the city center becomes expensive. If you go to New York, you expect it to be expensive in the city center. You go to London, you expect it. But everything's connected outside. You can take a train to Brooklyn in 12 minutes from the World Trade Center. So it's okay to have housing that may be slightly more affordable there because you can get there. So we're suffering from trying to do too much with too little. My wand is do too much to do too much, not too little.
Too much to do too much. That's perfect. I appreciate that. Thank you very much, Richard. This was fun, and I'm hoping that in a year or two we can have a second round of this conversation with better news, better development, and we go from there.
That's great. Thank you very much for inviting me on. It's been a pleasure.
Awesome. Just one last thing before you leave, please make sure to visit our website. We have put together a whole bunch of different resources that you can download for free from our website. These include checklists, manuals, and also access to previous webinars. In case you have missed any of our previous webinars, you can go there, get the replay link, download the slides, and benefit from all these free resources that we've gathered on the website. Please make sure to visit. Thank you.